All right, so I want to express a huge welcome to my zoology students for returning for second semester. And to start off this semester, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the annelids. And the annelids include the animals like earthworms, they include the marine worms, and they also include the leeches. And so this information is going to be found in chapter 17 of your textbook. So welcome to second semester. So as I had said, we're going to be looking at a special group of animals called the annelids. And so we're going to be looking at the phylum Annelida. Now, before we actually get started talking about this particular group of animals, what we need to do is we need to look at a very special type of body arrangement called metamerism. Now, it's also most commonly known as segmentation. So this is going to be the first time that we're looking at animals that actually are composed of repeated units or repeated segments. And if you look over here on the right, you can see this diagram definitely has an animal that is composed of repeated segments. Now, each major unit is going to contain the components of most of the major organ systems that are going to be found in that animal. Now, when we say major organ systems, we're talking about systems such as the circulatory system, digestive system, nervous system, and of course the excretory system. So if you look again at the picture on the right, you're going to notice as you make observations of each of the different units that are found or segments that are found in this animal, you're going to notice we definitely have a dorsal blood vessel that's going to be running through each of these segments, and of course that's part of the circulatory system. If you notice down here we have a nerve cord, and that's going to be running through again each of the segments. We also have some nephridium, which are going to be part of the excretory system in these animals, and of course this long intestine is going to make its way through each segment as well. So again, this is metamerism, this is segmentation, where each segment actually has part of the major organ systems found in that animal. Now, when you have a body arrangement like metamerism or segmentation, this is definitely going to increase the burrowing efficiency, and this does this by permitting independent movements of each of these segments, because we're going to find that these animals have both circular and longitudinal muscles, and each of these segments can actually move independently of each other. Now, these animals definitely have a more sophisticated nervous system, so we're no longer just looking maybe at a grouping of ganglia and maybe a few nerve fibers. We now have a very organized nerve cord that runs through the ventral part of these animals. Now, metamerism definitely provides what we call a safety factor. Now, basically what that means is that if one segment or metamere or somite, as we sometimes call these segments, fail, then the others could still possibly function in response to that. So it's kind of a safety factor for these animals to have this type of body arrangement. Now, some of the characteristics that are kind of unique to the phylum Annelida is that they have about 15,000 species. About 2/3 of these animals are going to be primarily marine worms, and it says obscure marine worms, which means a lot of times these worms will actually be hidden from view, so they'd be really hard to find. The other third are going to be primarily freshwater worms or terrestrial worms like the earthworm. Now again, as we said, segmentation is prevalent in this particular group, and the body segments are going to be marked by circular grooves called annuli. And so if you look at the diagram, or not the diagram, but the picture off to the right, you're going to notice that in this particular case of an earthworm, you can definitely see the annuli right through here. And a little across to the left of this particular earthworm, you're going to notice we have an example of a marine worm. And again, you can just barely see the annuli that make up each of the segments in this worm as well. Now down here we have a leech, so it's kind of hard to see the annuli here, and over here we have a tube worm, and what you see right here are actually the gills of this particular worm, but they also, if you were to look within the tube, they are made up of these annuli as well. Now another unique characteristic of the annelids, except for the leeches, is they have very, very tiny bristles that are called setae or setae, and they're chitinous in composition, so that's going to be what they're made out of. Now the short setae are going to anchor the segments, or act as anchor segments in the earthworms. If you think about whenever you've tried to pull an earthworm out of the ground, a lot of times they sort of get stuck. In other words, it's really hard to pull them out of the hole. What that basically is that those setae act as anchors, and so they're kind of bracing that worm against the side of the hole, so it prevents it from actually being pulled out. And so in essence, once you let go, that worm can slip back into the hole. Now, sometimes we'll see annelids with very long setae, and in this case, it's going to help these worms actually swim throughout their environment. Now, there's actually a couple of particular groups of annelids that we're going to look at in class, and the first group is going to be the polychaetes. And the polychaetes are primarily marine, and they're usually found in the lowest level of water that would be in the environment. So whether this is a lake or maybe an ocean or a sea, they're going to be found in these particular areas. And usually we refer to these areas as a benthic area for that area of water. So the other group that we're going to look at is called the oligochaetes, and we're also going to look at the leeches. Now, animals that belong to actually this group tend to primarily inhabit freshwater environments, or you're going to find them in sort of a terrestrial or land type of environment. So they're going to inhabit the soils. Now again, many of these particular animals that fall into this group are going to be predators in some way, especially when you look at the group called the leeches. So the body plan of these segmented worms is pretty unique. The head itself is composed of two parts. It's going to be composed of a part called the prostomium, and the second part is going to be called actually the peristomium. And if you look on the right here, we have an example of a marine worm, and the prostomium is going to be this part right here, and the periostomium is going to be the first segment right behind the head. And the terminal portion is going to be what we call the pygidium, and this is going to bear the anus of the animal. So again, if you look down here towards the bottom of the diagram, you're going to notice this last segment that you would find in this worm is called the pygidium, and the anus is going to be embedded right in this segment. Now, the head and the anus are not considered metameres. Now, remember, a metamere is a segment of this animal that contains all major organ systems. So you're not going to find those in the head region, and you're not going to find those in that very last segment called the pygidium. Now, new metameres are going to form in front of the anus. Now, what that means is that when you look at this part of the animal, all of the segments that you would find here are much younger than the segments that you would find in the more anterior region of the animal. Now, the surface is going to be covered with an epidermis and a very thin outer layer of non-chitinous cuticle. Now, remember when we talked about the nematodes, we had talked about a cuticle being the outermost layer in those animals. So in this case, these animals do have a cuticle, but it's not quite as thick as what you would find in a nematode. Now, they have very strong circular and longitudinal muscles that are going to underlie the body wall. And we're going to talk more about the muscles once we talk about the hydrostatic skeleton that's found in these animals, because of course these muscles are going to be used to help the animal move throughout its environment. Now, of course, when you talk about this group, it's really important that we mention that these are coelomates, so we're not talking about acoelomates or pseudocoelomates anymore. Now we're getting into groups of animals that actually do have a defined coelom. Now, they have something called peritoneum, and we're going to see this repeatedly as we go through different groups this semester. Now, this peritoneum is a mesodermal epithelium, and this is going to line the body wall and actually form dorsal and ventral mesentery. So remember, dorsal is on top and the ventral is going to be on the bottom. So again, if you look over here on the right hand side, you're going to notice we have something called a parietal peritoneum, which is going to be located right here, and we also have a visceral peritoneum, which is going to be right around the gut tube right here. Now, this peritonia is going to actually meet to form something called the septa. Now, if you notice over here, you're going to notice we have sort of this kind of bluish area right here. So between this peritoneum and this peritoneum, there's going to be a layer of tissue. So as you look at each of the segments found in these animals, there's going to be a separation. There's going to be sort of like a wall, and that's going to be the septum that divides each of these different segments from each other. Now, the gut and the longitudinal blood vessels will extend through the septa. So as we said, you're going to find all of the major organ systems in most of the segments in these worms. And so all of those organ systems, whatever happens to make up, whatever organs, whatever structures make up each of those systems, needs to pass through that septum. So if you notice, the gut tube definitely will pass through that septum, and you notice the major blood vessels, which would be the dorsal and the ventral blood vessels, will pass through that as well. Now, as I had said before, we're going to talk about the skeleton in these animals as being a hydrostatic skeleton. Now, of course, if it's a hydrostatic skeleton, We're talking about a skeleton that is going to function partly in response to being filled with fluid. Now, except in leeches, the coelom itself is going to be filled with fluid, and as we had said, it's going to serve as that hydrostatic skeleton. So we had said that there were two different types of muscles. We had longitudinal and we had circular. So any contraction of longitudinal muscles in these animals is going to cause the body to shorten and definitely expand. And so when you have longitudinal muscles that actually run the length of the worm, when they contract, it causes that worm to actually shrink up. Now, the contraction of the circular muscles, so those muscles that actually go around the animal, when they contract, it's basically going to squeeze that animal. And of course, if you squeeze that animal, it's going to cause that animal to lengthen or to narrow. So by separating this force into sections, widening and elongation actually move the whole animal. So alternate waves of contraction, or what we call peristalsis, actually allow a pretty efficient burrowing mechanism for these animals. Now, swimming annelids definitely will use their muscles in sort of a different way. They're going to use them sort of in a wave-like type of motion, and this is going to allow them to be able to sort of swim or kind of glide throughout their aquatic environment. Now, the first group that we're going to look at, the first class that we're going to look at that's found within the Phylum Annelida is going to be the class Polychaeta. Now, polychaetes are the largest class of annelids. As we had said, about 2/3 of the annelids are going to be marine worms, and a large number of them fall into this particular category. There's more than 10,000 species of polychaetes, and again, as we had said, most of them are marine, vary from 1 to 3 actually meters long, so 1 millimeter to 3 meters. More specialization of sensory organs. Now, as we look at the head of these animals, and we'll do this in lab, you're going to find it's very, very different from the worms that you're going to find in the clatellets, which is going to include the earthworms and the leeches. Now, these polychaetes definitely tolerate a very wide range of salinity, so they can live in quite a few different habitats. In terms of aquatic habitats, of course, as we said, they're mostly marine, but the salinity can definitely vary for these animals. Warmer regions definitely have more freshwater polychaetes than they would marine polychaetes. Now, some of these are going to live in crevices, others are going to inhabit tubes, like the one you see over here on the right-hand side. This is a good example, again, of a tube worm. And some of them are considered pelagic, and what that means is that they're going to live in open water. Now, as I had said, the polychaetes have a very well differentiated head with pretty obvious sense organs. Now, when we use the word differentiated, what we're talking about here is that there's several different parts that make up this head region. Now, paired appendages called parapodia, and you can see the parapodia right here on these animals, are going to be found on most segments. You typically don't find the parapodia on the head region or maybe on that pygidium that we had talked about a little bit earlier, and that's the last segment of the worm. Now, there's not going to be any clatellum in these particular worms. You're going to find the clatellum in the earthworms and the leeches, which we'll get to later on. Many CT are going to be arranged in bundles on that parapodia. So when you look at this parapodia right here, and each one of these, as I had said, represents a parapodia, it's actually composed of many CT, those little bristles that we had talked about earlier. Now, polychaetes may be sedentary, which means they don't move around too much. They could be free moving, they could be burrowing, or they could actually be crawling. Now, the clamworm, also known as the Nereus, is a good example of a predatory polychaete, and they have jaws that actually are found within a muscular pharynx. Now, it says the jaws on these animals are eversible, and what that means basically is this. If you look down here towards the bottom, you can see a good example of the jaws that you would find in Nereus. And this right here is going to be the pharynx of the animal. And basically, most of the time, when you look at the jaws or the pharynx of this animal, it's actually found contained within that head region. But when these animals actually prey on other animals, they're going to protrude that pharynx and, in essence, protrude those jaws and use those as well. And so that's what they mean by an eversible type of jaw. Now, the prostomium may or may not be retractable, and that's what we were talking about in the previous slide in regards to the eversible nature of the pharynx and the jaws of these animals. So this is, again, going to be the prostomium of this animal. Now remember, the peristomium is going to be that segment right behind the head. Now this peristomium is also often going to bear the eyes, the tentacles, and the sensory palps in the animal. It's going to surround the mouth, may or may not have setae. It just kind of depends on the animal. Obviously the palps are going to be there, and it could have chitinous jaws depending again how these animals feed. Now some of them will be considered ciliary feeders, and if they are, they're going to bear a tentacular crown that's going to open up sort of like a fan. So that's going to be the tube worms that we had mentioned earlier. But again, that fan can actually be withdrawn into the tube, and sometimes that crown actually serves two functions. It actually can serve not only as a feeding mechanism, but also as a mechanism for gills, which is going to be a way for these animals to absorb oxygen. Now, most segments of the trunk are going to bear what we call parapodia, as we had said before. So again, right up here, you can see the parapodia. And these parapodia could have lobes, could have cirri, could have setae, or those bristles, and there could definitely be some other parts that are found depending on the type of worm that you're looking at. Now, these parapodia are going to aid the animal in crawling, swimming, and anchoring the tube or anchoring the worm within the tube, again, depending on the type of polychaete that we're looking at. Now, usually the chief respiratory organ for this particular worm is going to be the gills. And again, over here on the right, you can see the gills being illustrated right through here in this tube worm. So when you look at the digestive system of a polychaete, you're going to find they actually have what we call a foregut, they have a midgut, and they have a hindgut, which basically is describing the gut tube as it passes throughout the animal. So of course, fore is going to be the beginning, probably about a third of the animal. The midgut is going to be the middle point, and of course the hindgut is going to be the very end of the animal. Now the foregut has what we call a stomodium, and it's also going to have a pharynx. It's also going to have an anterior esophagus, and this interior esophagus is going to be lined with a cuticle. Now remember, we had said the cuticle was actually something we would think would actually be found on the outside of the animal, and actually that's the case. During embryonic development with a lot of these worms, this particular digestive tract is actually going to sort of enfold on itself, and originally during embryonic development that cuticle is on the outside, but as it enfolds, it actually becomes positioned on the inside of the animals, and that's kind of the reasons why the cuticle is on the inside. Now the midgut is going to be derived from mesoderm. It's going to be used to secrete enzymes, and of course it's going to be used to secrete, or actually not secrete, but absorb nutrients. Now it has a very short hindgut. This is going to be derived from the ectoderm of the tissue layers that are found in this animal, and it's going to lead to the anus and to the pygidium that we had talked about earlier on in the screencast. Remember, the pygidium is where you're going to find the anus of the worm. Now some polychaetes are predators, of course, like the Nereus, and some of them are going to be scavengers. Now, sedentary polychaetes are going to feed on suspended particles. Remember what we had said before. In regards to some of these sedentary polychaetes, they sort of have what we would call sort of a crown of feather-like structures that actually are protruding from the tube that they actually inhabit, and they can use these sort of feather-like appendages to feed, so it's sort of kind of like just grabbing suspended particles from the environment, or sometimes they're actually used in terms of gas exchange as well. Now most of these animals are going to have, of course, as we had said, parapodia, and they're going to have gills for gas exchange. Well, there's going to be a few out there that will actually use their body surface as gas exchange also. Now you're going to find if you actually compared a large number of these animals to each other, the circulatory system is going to vary. Now in Nereus, which is the one you're going to look at in lab, the dorsal blood vessel, so that one that actually runs along the top of the animal, is going to carry the blood forward, and the ventral vessel, which is the one that lies along the bottom of the animal, is going to carry the blood to the posterior end of the animal. Now blood is going to flow across between these major vessels in networks around the parapodia and of course the intestine. Now excretion in these animals is going to vary again depending on the type of animal that you're looking at. Could be protonephridia, could be metanephridia, and we've talked about nephridia in the past. So of course these are excretory organs, or it actually could be a combination of the two. Now when you look at polychaetes and you look at the nervous system and the sense organs, you're going to find they actually have a ventral nerve cord, and again ventral, remember, is going to be towards the bottom, that's going to run the length of the worm with ganglia in each metamere. Now remember, ganglia is just going to be a group of nerves, and the sense organs in these animals will include the eyes, It's going to include something called the nuchal organs, and it's also going to include, of course, some statuses for some species that would burrow and build tubes within the environment. Now, the eyes of these animals could range from very simple eye spots to very well-developed image-resolving eyes. And again, this is going to be very similar to the eyes that you saw in the group of mollusks that we looked at in class. Now, the nuchal organs that I had mentioned are going to be ciliated sensory pits, and these are probably chemoreceptive in nature. Now, over here on the right, you can see an example of a polychaete, and you notice the head region, of course. There's some antennae or tentacles that you see right through here. You have the palps, which we had mentioned a little bit earlier. Again, those palps could be sort of tactile or maybe chemoreceptive in nature. You can see the nuchal organ, which is represented by the NO right here. You can see where its placement is, right about here. And the eyes of these animals, you would expect them to maybe be up here, but they're actually right here. Now down here we have an example of the nervous system. As we had said, they have a ventral nerve cord that runs the length of the animal. Obviously we have some peripheral nerves that actually branch from that nerve cord, and if you notice we have a brain as well. So when you guys actually dissect into your earthworm, this is going to be one of the very first times you guys will actually see a brain inside of your dissected specimen. Now the reproduction and development in polychaetes is actually pretty interesting. Polychaetes actually have no permanent sex organs. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at an animal that is actually cyclic or seasonal in nature. So as the season approaches, that's when you're going to get development or maturity of those sex organs. Now we do have separate male and female members within this group, so they are considered dioecious. The gonads are going to appear as simple, as we had said, temporary swellings of a peritoneum. The gametes are going to be shed into the coelom, and they're going to exit either by the gonoducts, metanephridia, or simply a rupturing of the body. And so what you have over here on the right-hand side is actually a mass spawning of polychaetes. And in this case, you're looking at animals where these areas that you see right here are actually the reproductive parts in these animals. And so what happens is these reproductive parts actually will be released by the worm. And during this time, as they're released, they kind of float up to the surface, and these parts will actually rupture or they will explode. And when they do that, of course, it releases all the different gametes, so the sperm and the egg. So fertilization is considered external, and the early larvae in this particular worm does have a special name, and it's called a trochophore. Alright, so that's going to finish up our very first screencast for Chapter 17, the Phylum Annelida. So again, as always, please make sure that you have completed your study guide before you come to class.